Again, good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to this elective, The Art of Filmmaking in Women's Agency. I'm pleased at this time to welcome our moderator, Dr. Mary Raum. She's a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College here. And I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Raum.
All right, good morning, everyone. Really glad to have you here. We have two filmmakers. One's going to be online, and you'll be watching her on the screen. And we have Ms. Vanessa Hope here. Both are award-winning documentary specialists, and I think you'll find it really interesting. They're going to play some film clips. We're going to give each one about a half hour to do their presentations, and then we're going to say 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So with that, can we go online now with the first presenter? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear and see me.
Evelyn, can you hang on for a second?
Absolutely.
We're not seeing you yet. This is Dr. Evelyn Pauls. She's signing in from Europe, so give her. Okay, good. Got the
See
first
myself
slide.
on the screen now, so I think you guys can see me as well.
Okay.
All right. I'll get started then. Thank you so much, Mary and everyone, for inviting me to be part of this symposium. I'm very excited also to share the panel with Vanessa, and very happy to hear more also about her work. Thank you also for the tech team to make it possible that I can attend from Italy, which is where I'm logging on from today, and for bringing up my slides and sharing the video. So let me tell you a little bit about my work, my projects, and I'll take you away. So I'm Evelyn Pauls. I'm an independent researcher and consultant with the Berghof Foundation, which is a conflict transformation NGO that's based in Berlin in Germany. And with them, over the last sort of 5-6 years, I've worked on participatory filmmaking, primarily with female ex-combatants in different contexts. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Next slide, please. I'll focus on the filmmaking aspect, given that that's what the panel is about, and then I'll also bring some insights of what we actually learned from those films, because originally Mary was very kind to introduce me as a filmmaker, which is sort of my newest endeavor. But really, I'm a researcher by training, and I've worked on combatant issues in different countries, contexts around the world for about over 10 years now. And so the filmmaking, I'm kind of new to it, let's say. So you'll see here a map of where we've done work with female ex-combatants over the last years. There's 2 films that have been produced here, and I'll be happy to share links with them. They're available on YouTube, so you can watch them easily. And we've worked in 6 different conflict contexts. And today I'll talk about the newest film, which came out last year, which looked at Colombia and Uganda. And the previous film that came out in 2020, where we worked with ex-combatants in Burundi, in Aceh, which is the region of Indonesia, in Mindanao, a region of the Philippines, and also in Nepal. And I'll be happy to answer questions about any of these cases later on. So overall, there were 60 women who had been associated with armed groups who have participated in our project. And all their stories are featured in 2 booklets which we've published that I also have here, and some of their stories are featured in the films. We have filmed, I think, in 7 different languages. Everyone was able to speak in their local language, and then we translated them into English subtitles, and you'll see a bit later. So what's important about these films, and this I should mention from the beginning, is that they were initiated by female ex-combatants themselves, specifically by a female ex-combatant organization in Nepal, who has been in touch with the Berghof Foundation. It's an NGO that I mentioned before. For years, they've worked together in the peace process, and they really wanted to find a way to memorialize and collect their wartime experiences. And what they found is that they didn't really have time or capacity to do any of that. So they approached this NGO and said, hey, can you help us facilitate this process, find a way where we can collect our wartime experiences, and this is really how the project started. I was very lucky to join that and work with these women from around the world. I should mention also that I worked with 8 women as co-researchers and co-filmmakers on this project, who are ex-combatants themselves or women who were associated with armed groups. The way they identify depends on the context. So this is Violeta Godnamova from Colombia, Beatrice Achiro from Uganda, Grace Nishunga from Burundi, Salawati Pasa from Aceh, Leela Sharma and Trupani Baijali from Nepal, Alabai Buzan and Gypsy Buzan from Mindanao. And then I was also joined by an actually documentary award-winning filmmaker, Juan Camilo Cruz, my good friend and colleague from Colombia, who I've worked with on these projects. So I've brought you some images from when we were making the film, and so you'll see them on the slides in front of you, just to give you a bit of an impression of what it was like to make these movies. So what's important is that, as I said, it was initiated by an ex-combatant group, and we worked participatorily throughout the whole process, which means that women determined what questions were asked, what topics were explored, and ultimately what stories were told. Next slide, please. So today I'll focus on, as I said, on the documentary filmmaking aspect of it, but I'm happy to answer any questions also about the cases. And so I'll focus on participatory filmmaking as a feminist method in conflict studies, to look at women in conflict and female combatants in particular, in order to acknowledge the power dynamics and hierarchy between mostly researchers based in the global north, who are often studying women in conflict in the global south. And so I'm trying to interrogate this hierarchy as well as a more practical aspect, which is to bring this research and the insights to new and broader audiences. So what I'm hoping to give you today is an honest account of the practicalities and challenges, financial and ethical, of conducting participatory research in this way in global south contexts. I'll talk about why we decided to do it and how we did it, and then you'll see a little bit of what came out of it. Next slide, please. So why participatory documentary filmmaking in the first place? So what I would argue is that working in this mode gives us a potential answer to the question, how do we reveal and make visible the complexity of women's roles in conflicts without speaking for or about them? What often happens is when researchers and often also peacebuilding practitioners try to give an impression of what women's lives in conflicts are about, we often end up speaking about them, which is often a result simply of the fact that we as people based in the global north have access to spaces and people who they maybe don't, simply because of where they are located, what languages they might speak, educational level, etc. And so what we try to do with these projects and with these films is to engage women in a way that does not universalize or homogenize their experience and reinforce, quote, hierarchies of women from the north as speakers and women from the south as those who are spoken of. This is a quote by Sophie Harmon, who writes a lot about filmmaking as well, and who has really been an inspiration also for my work. And what's important to note is that participatory filmmaking and research as such is not a solution to these hierarchies. So not simply by working in this way, we overcome these hierarchies, but what I think it does is it really brings them to the fore and forces you in a way to address them. So working in this way allows you to acknowledge the discomfort around co-production, especially around financial and material imbalances, which are often not talked about in filmmaking and research, to be honest. They are an integral part of whenever we work with people in conflict-affected contexts. This should invite the researcher and the filmmaker to critically reflect on the process, rather than shying away from these questions or just glossing them over and hoping, that they will not affect really the work that we're doing. Another reason why I decided to work in this way, this coming more from an academic point of view, is that, as you are probably well aware, there's a limited, academic formats are often limited in the way that you can express yourself or what kind of knowledge is dominant. And we found that only through collaboration with these women in research, design and in implementation of the project, was it really possible to bring their stories across as they intend to without being limited by academic formats and language? And so this was just to give you a little bit of an anecdote. It was quite hard to navigate at times because let's say people who were like women who were experienced in working with white Western researchers or NGO professionals, as they were really kind of used to telling a particular story. Like they were used to telling a story either of how they suffered through the war, or how they became a peace builder now, or they were kind of these like taken for granted stories that they would like take out of the hat and like present to the researcher. And we really had to do a lot of work to say, no, this is really not what we're looking for. It's really about what you want to talk about. Next slide, please. And another consideration for us was that film has the potential to reach a diverse audience, to bring it back to them, both to conflict-affected communities, but also to international audiences, such as yourselves, or students, or policymakers, international organizations, etc. To quote again Sophie Harmon, she says, "To make invisible women visible and to see politics necessitates audience and consumption of that visibility. So as researchers, we should really think about ways of making our work accessible, both to the people affected to it and maybe the people who we are trying to influence with this." And the standard academic research output of journal articles or book publications is largely inaccessible to the female ex-combatants and their communities for sure. Whereas our films had already quite a lot of reach, at least for my standards. We've had over 2,600 views of the film and over 65,000 views of the booklets. This is in English alone, exists also in other languages. This is roughly, I checked yesterday, around 650 downloads of an academic article I published on this, which was in academic world not bad, but quite different to the reach of the video. Next slide, please. So how did we make the films? We recruited female ex-combatants as researchers with the help of ex-combatants organizations that are based in all the 6 countries that we worked in. In terms of requirements for this work, we didn't require any knowledge of the English language, any academic background, any filmmaking background. The only thing that was necessary was that you were an ex-combatant and you were interested in the topic, so exploring filmmaking. Obviously paid these researchers. I talked about material imbalances before, so it's important to acknowledge that. And we provided them with film equipment which they get to keep after the project, so they can continue using the material. In terms of the participatory method, I should say that instead of me as a researcher traveling, or researcher/filmmaker traveling to the countries to interview participants or film interviews, a colleague who I've mentioned before, Juan, and I held around 1 week long film and research workshops in each location, which trained the researchers and filmmakers for what we're about to do. And then they went and filmed largely independently for around a period of 3 to 6 months, depending on the context. And so our trainings covered both technical documentary filmmaking skills, practical exercise of working with the camera. You see here an image of that. Next slide, please. And also collaborative sessions on designing the questions, the interview questionnaires, the research topics that would guide the filming. And these topics are decided first and foremost by the researchers, who are ex-combatants, themselves. So they can look really, really different depending on the context. Just to give you some examples, from the first movie in the Philippines, for example, they really wanted to focus on intergenerational trauma. So kind of how the conflict legacies from grandmothers to mothers to daughters today kind of filter through. In Nepal, for example, people really wanted to focus on political participation and what that looked like for female ex-combatants in a post-conflict scenario. And then in the new movie, where you see an excerpt from in a minute, in Uganda, for example, the women really wanted to focus on stigma that they're facing today in the communities that they live in, and the effect that their conflict past has on their children, who are young adults today. Apologies. Editing of the movie, this is what I should say, was done centrally, so by my Colombian colleagues, after our researchers selected the bits of the story that they wanted to include. We looked for a lot of ways to make this process participatory, but with, in some cases, literacy limitations and obviously a language barrier. It was often very difficult to get the research to do it themselves, though we found this kind of mode of a lot of back and forth where they kind of select the stories that they want to be included in the final movie, and then we did the editing. And then kind of to conclude this, this question of how we made the movies, the last point is, of course, how we disseminate them. And this also looked really different depending on the context. For example, I just talk about the new movie now. In Colombia, our researchers decided that it was best to do two different kind of screenings. One in the territories where a lot of combatants are based in the north of the country, where we did screenings that brought together combatants and conflict-affected civilians, which allowed for a lot of fruitful discussion after the movie based on the topics that came up. And then we had a second event in Bogota that included more of an international audience and also Colombian policymakers who got to discuss the issues that were brought up. In Uganda, this looked really different because both the women that participated and also the researchers and partner organization there decided that it was actually most important to disseminate the movie amongst other combatants. Many of them had met for the first time, actually, as they participated first in the training and then in the movie, and they wanted to keep this kind of discussion circles going as a way of trauma management. So we used the movie way more locally there and created a revolving funds for participants to join together and kind of meet and discuss both the movie but also ongoing issues that they face. And then, of course, there's the kind of the international element where I do a lot of dissemination, for example, in events such as today, but we've also done film screenings in Australia, in Ireland, in the UK, also here in Italy, etc. So before we watch a short excerpt of the film, just a couple of words about the two cases. Many of you will be familiar with them, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. So Colombia, as you know, after over 50 years of civil war, the country's biggest guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, I'll refer to them as FARC, signed a peace agreement in Havana in 2016. Women represented up to 35% of FARC's membership, and many of them joined to break out of traditional gender roles in civilian society and felt somewhat of a sense of liberation and agency during their time in the FARC. And I'll talk a little bit after the excerpt of the movie about how that looked like after. Uganda, the conflict context there, also many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the LRA and its infamous leader, Joseph Kony, who's still being hunted by the US military today, and also the Wagner Group, quite active on that. There was a recent piece in the Rolling Stone on that. Throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, the LRA waged a brutal war in northern Uganda, and they're very infamous for abducting tens of thousands of children to serve as soldiers and sex slaves in its ranks. Estimated 30% of LRA members were female. Almost all of them were forcibly recruited, and almost all of them returned with children from their time in the group. In northern Uganda, there was no official peace agreement with the LRA and also no formal DDR process. So, and given that this is a WPS Symposium, I selected a short excerpt where the women talk about gender and reintegration, and I'll say a couple of words after also about our insights. So if you could please play the excerpt, thank you.
Yo creo que fue muy rápido el tránsito de la vida en armas a la vida civil. Yo hablo por mí, no estábamos preparados para que llegara este momento.
She was abducted. She's a family abducted. She was once in LRA. She has just escaped, and she's just pretending. Yeah, so people have started now stigmatizing me.
El enfoque de género en el acuerdo de paz como algo transversalizado, pues pensábamos que lo íbamos a palpar, que íbamos a sentir que era algo que de alguna forma nos iba a beneficiar no solamente a nosotras como mujeres provenientes de las FARC, sino a las de las comunidades.
Loko do lead dog na dog la wa ber te te ka pe no lum jan yin pe mer ba pe be no ai mir ne nyo cho ana cho ko cha lo mo ne ko cho ana.
Y fue mucho, por ejemplo, lo que se dijo del baby boom y todo el mundo habló de los hijos e hijas de la paz, pero hoy día nadie se acuerda de los hijos e hijas de la paz. Pero además crecen en una sociedad absolutamente estigmatizante, en una sociedad que no le está abriendo sus puertas hacia la paz, hacia la inclusión, sino que por el contrario pues tiende a relegarlos y a cerrarles cada vez las puertas.
Yo, por ejemplo, milité 20 años en la FARC y la participación y la experiencia que yo tuve en la FARC sobre el género fue 50 o 100 años adelante de esta sociedad, porque realmente en la FARC no había ninguna discriminación, que tú eras mujer y que yo era hombre.
Nuestra experiencia creo que también nos deja unas enseñanzas supremamente grandes para poder, a partir de allí, de los aprendizajes que tuvimos, poder ahorita en este proceso de paz partir de eso.
We went through a lot, but that will not determine our future. And we should use the previous life we had to make us have that good future.
Thank you. So this was just a really short excerpt from the movie, and what you can already see is that women in both groups had really vastly different experiences in terms of how they became members of the group, what their roles were during the conflict, and how this time shaped lives post-conflict. And this underlines really the importance of not homogenizing the experiences of female ex-combatants, but highlighting how the different experiences shape their lives. Still, some similarities between these two contexts are striking, such as the stigma that the women often still face from their communities, lack of educational and socioeconomic opportunities for them and their children, and the need to turn to each other for support. Next slide, please. Just a couple of words on of both of these contexts. So in Colombia, despite a focus on the inclusion of gender in the 2016 Peace Accord, implementation, especially from the perspective of female ex-combatants living in reintegration zones, is severely lacking. They continue to face stigmatization, economic hardship, very limited opportunities for furthering their education or creating sustainable livelihoods. And similarly, in Uganda, although most women who were abducted by the LRA as children returned from the bush many years, even decades ago, they still face the consequences of that time daily. Community stigmatization, lack of economic opportunity, and long-term health concerns are ever present. This is something that we found also in the first movie. Many women who joined the FARC to escape from structural and family violence found the same difficult life reality again after coming back. Political, social, and economic violence, mainly against poor rural communities, which most ex-combatants belong to, has not stopped in Colombia. Ex-combatants, especially those in community leadership roles, continue to be the victims of targeted assassinations and violence today. Women in the FARC generally took on largely the same roles as their male comrades, sharing cooking, cleaning, and also combat duties largely equally. And this meant that in the post-agreement period where we are today, there is a sense that what they perceive as this progress towards gender equality has been reversed, with a majority of female ex-combatants today describing a return, or at least an expectation to return, to traditional gender roles, including care work and child rearing. Next slide, please. The biggest concern for most returnee women from Uganda is the marginalization that their children who are born in captivity face today. Due to a lack of family ties, these children usually have no claims to land due to patrilineal land ownership in Uganda, and are not accepted by the clan-based social structures, and therefore have no community belonging, in their words. And this exclusion reduces their economic opportunities, which might then drive them to criminal activity, which then in turn causes more discrimination. So it's kind of a downward spiral. And also in Colombia, as we've heard in the excerpt, the children of the post-2016 so-called baby boom are often facing a similar combination of societal exclusion and lack of educational opportunities. Next slide, please. So to conclude, hearing from the women who have lived through conflict directly can teach us as an international audience important lessons for current peace processes and reintegration efforts. DR and more long-term reintegration programs run by the UN with the support of others have gone through many iterations and have gradually developed to become more context-specific and gender-sensitive. And when we launched the movie last year, we had the UNDP Global Advisor on Reintegration in the discussion of the film premiere, and she really emphasized that the focus should be on supporting community-based reintegration approaches so that communities can develop their own solution and create services for former combatants to return to and be accepted. Where there is a peace agreement, like in Colombia, implementing it in full with sufficient capacity and resources allocated also for the included gender provisions, if they exist, is a prerequisite for continued commitment of former conflict parties to the peace process and can prevent a return to violence. Reintegration programs should utilize and value female ex-combatants' capacities to contribute to peace building and reconciliation with skills they have developed during their time in the group. For example, managing conflict in a diverse group of people, building community in difficult circumstances, or pushing for gender equality. So we have to think a little bit outside the box, right, for how we can transform wartime agency into peacetime agency here. And building their confidence and contributing to creating an environment in which they can take on leadership roles in their communities after would be one way of doing so. And just a final note, filmmaking such as this also be a way for women and men who are currently members of armed groups, maybe they're preparing for peace talks or implementing peace agreements themselves, to hear from others who have experienced similar things whom they would have never been able to meet face-to-face, a kind of remote peer-to-peer learning. So I'll leave it at that for now. I thank you very much for the time and happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Dr. Pauls, thank you very much. This is Mary Raum. We're going to have Ms. Vanessa Hope give her presentation, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you could hang out online, and we'd appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be at the Naval War College, and among all of you, I've really been learning a lot, meeting you and hearing your stories, and I'm incredibly interested in making more films with a women, peace, and security focus. So if you have ideas for films or stories that you want told and you want to bring them to me or you want to raise them here in this context, that's great. And I also am curious because my focus is China, Taiwan, and I speak Chinese. How many people in the room know about China, Taiwan, focus on it? I mean, I assume most of you know more than I do on the military side of things. My focus has really been on diplomacy, and I made a first documentary feature following Obama's U.S. ambassador to China, John Huntsman. And I finished that film in 2015 and had been tracking developments in Taiwan and thought that they might elect their first female president in January 2016. So I joined an international delegation to monitor that the elections were free and fair as a way to be on the ground in Taipei. And I worked with a local film crew, and I was present when President Tsai won, and it was incredible. And the crowd was overjoyed, and the screen behind her was blaring, "We are Taiwanese." And, you know, the very first time I lived in Taiwan as a student was 1995-96, which was the year they became a democracy, and China was firing missiles at us on the island to prevent those first elections. And the US sent 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait, north and south of the island. And first time I ever used a camera was to run around filming during Lee Teng-hui's inauguration weekend, and I actually have that footage in this film. So I've been touring with the film that I made which is called Invisible Nation, which began when I was in Taipei and witnessed and filmed President Tsai's win. I thought she would be an excellent window into the story of Taiwan, because it's something that I had understood only in the US-China relationship context, which is the US sells arms to Taiwan. That pisses off the Chinese government. And this is where we are. But I knew Taiwan had its own story to tell. It hadn't been taught to me. I first studied East Asian history in high school, and then I was in college and a PhD. I didn't really get to understand Taiwan's story in its own, in the voices of the people of Taiwan. And I actually think that we're fortunate with this film, because in the last 5 years, and again, I've been making it over the 2 terms of President Tsai, in the last 5 years, there's been a new wave of books and movies from people in Taiwan and the diaspora looking at Taiwan's identity. And I think it's really grown with the development of their democracy since '96. So my story and Taiwan's story feel very intertwined. And it was a true privilege and honor to follow President Tsai and the women in her administration who she chose, who are incredible leaders. One who I began filming as a legislator, Bi Kim Hsiao, is then she became Taiwan's de facto ambassador to the United States. Now she's vice president. So many of the women in the film had these trajectories. It's also the case that in Taiwan, their democracy would not have developed in the way that it did without women being on the front lines pushing for change. And some of those women are in the film. Chun Chu, who became a kind of secretary general to President Tsai, had been in the democracy movement and then put in jail as one of the Kaohsiung 8. Kaohsiung, as you know, is a big city in the south of Taiwan on the coast. And she thought she was going to die in prison. So she said in her will that she was dedicating her life to the people of Taiwan. And I think because of that was one of the most popularly elected officials. She was governor of mayor of Kaohsiung for over 8 years. She is like a unifier, I would say, between the Democratic Progressive Party, which is President Tsai's party, and the KMT, which, as you all know, is the Chinese Nationalist Party, who we supported. The United States government was supporting Chiang Kai-shek, and when they lost the civil war to the communists and fled to Taiwan, we continued supporting his military dictatorship. He put the people of Taiwan under the second longest period of martial law until the one that's been in Syria, 38 years, and it was only lifted in 1987. So all of this is in the film, Invisible Nation. I've never just given a presentation and shown clips until I was just in the UK Parliament, House of Lords, speaking about the film. And the clips I'm showing you are the clips they chose, because I didn't have time to choose other clips. I can easily make a screening happen for you here at the Naval War College, and I think that that should happen. And it's better to have the full film in context. But you should know that after the first film, I read Valerie Hudson's book, Sex and World Peace, because I was pretty aware as a woman making that film that there aren't many women in foreign policy and in decision-making positions in diplomacy. And so I actually ended up getting a grant to begin this film, Invisible Nation, from the Compton Foundation in San Francisco to focus on women, peace, and security as an angle. I think that, plus the proposal I wrote with a Taiwanese woman producer that we presented to the president's office, is how we got the access to President Tsai, which is very unique. I'm aware of everything. Paul, what was the name of the woman who did that? Yes, Dr. Pauls just spoke about in terms of the power dynamics in filming and positionality of the filmmaker. Obviously, I did not have power over the president of Taiwan. That was not an issue. But I was very excited to learn from these women. And I think ultimately what became clear, knowing the women, peace, and security ideas, was that the fact of Taiwan being represented by these women at this time when major events were happening in the world, from Xi Jinping's speech in 2019, the first by a leader of China in 40 years to the people of Taiwan, not renouncing the use of force, to the crackdown on the people of Hong Kong, which showed the people of Taiwan that Deng Xiaoping's idea from 1978 of one country, two systems really will not work for Taiwan. It was always intended for Taiwan, tested on Hong Kong. People of Taiwan said absolutely not. To the outbreak of COVID and how well the people of Taiwan handled it, but their exclusion from the United Nations, the World Health Assembly, is a huge detriment to the international community. And then you start to, basically, I started to understand the entire kind of isolation and marginalization of Taiwan on the international stage when it's being represented by women is emblematic of the entire women, peace, and security idea and agenda, which is, this is not what should be happening, but there is no easy answer, because you can't just give diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, or you will be pissing off the Chinese government and crossing one of their red lines, most likely. They will not make that entirely clear. How do we deal with dictators? How do we deal with this right-wing turn across the world, with all of them, from Putin and Xi Jinping to Orban, and who knows how Trump will behave, banding together to a certain extent, or certainly collaborating and being anti-democratic. These were questions that were on my mind while making the film. And again, I'm not entirely sure what you're going to see in the clips. I think when I was in the parliament in the UK, and also we screened the film in the German parliament, it was more about diplomacy. So I'm very open to all your ideas. If you have women, peace, and security stories you want to be made into films. My husband's also a producer. And I am very open to your thoughts about what would bring a diplomatic breakthrough for Taiwan in a way, because I think even when you understand the importance of military deterrence, which we do for Taiwan, and we're the only country sworn to defend them militarily, first of all, we can't win in a conventional war against China, and neither can Taiwan. And we're talking about nuclear powers here. And second of all, you will always need diplomacy, no matter what. So let's maybe figure out a way to start with diplomacy and let this film lead the conversation. We've played in over 40, 50 countries all over the world. We've been winning awards. We're in the race for an Oscar and a BAFTA, and we worked collaboratively. I did with local Taiwanese crew, composer, editors. The editors are all using pseudonyms because they don't want to have a backlash from the Chinese government. That was always a concern for me too. I made this film anyway, and please play whatever I've got here. I have no idea what you're going to see. Enjoy.
So it's sad how little the leadership of the United States over the years has learned.
So what am I supposed to do? Serve you coffee? I thought the standard procedure is that I should pour coffee for you, but they have done this already. So we're not supposed to talk about serious matters while we eat then.
We could talk more about your experience at Cornell or London School of Economics.
Cornell is in the middle of nowhere, and it's cold.
Yeah.
Freezing cold.
Yeah.
Leaving Taiwan for the first time to study at Cornell. My mother was actually crying, and she said that, oh, if life there wasn't good for you, do come back. Wouldn't think that this is a failure. So do come back when you think that you want to go home. But I have a very small suitcase. My mom was wondering whether I would be able to survive with that little suitcase.
I think one of the most important, interesting stories to me is World Trade Organization negotiations were going on. She was one of the leads for Taiwan. And one of the people who did the negotiating from the U.S. side told me that she was so smart that they would be done with a session and they'd get ready to leave, and she would say to them, well, here's some questions you didn't ask but you should have. And I don't think she meant it as a put down. It's just that's the kind of person she is, a very detailed person.
In year 2000, I was asked to be the head of Mainland Affairs Council to deal with a very complicated issue, which is managing the relationship with China.
My feeling is that people generally are very cautious on cross-strait issues.
And you cannot afford saying something wrong.
When we engage with China, so we want to make sure whether China is a credible body to deal with.
I think we should just run through all the clips. It's weird seeing them out of context. That's so sorry.
台湾是存在的，而且台湾是重要的，但是它在政治上，因为中国的压力，他没有办法来承认台湾。
There's a lot of misunderstanding, especially outside of Asia, with regard to Taiwan splitting from China, splitting from the mainland. It's just a historical fact that Taiwan has never been controlled, not for a second, by the People's Republic of China. Over the past 400 years, Taiwan has been colonized by multiple governments. The earliest colonizers were the Dutch. They were followed by the Spanish, and then the Ming loyalist Zheng Chenggong and the Qing dynasty. And then Japan controlled Taiwan and ruled it as its first colony from 1895 until 1945. The only time that you ever had a China-based government that controlled both China and all of Taiwan was from 1945 until 1949, when it lost the Civil War to the communists. That 4-year period is the only time that China and Taiwan have been ruled by the same government at the same time.
The Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949 by winning a civil war against the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. So when the Nationalist Party pulled out and went to Taiwan, the U.S. continued to recognize that government, and we were containing communist China because it was red and communist and it was allied with the Soviet Union.
From that time on, Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan said, I'm the real government of all of China. While at the same time in Beijing, you had a government by Mao Zedong who also said, I am the real government of all of China. So you had two competing Chinas.
Back in 1971, the government in Beijing is not present in the United Nations. And for many countries in the world, this was a very strange kind of fiction, because a government representing, around almost 1 billion people should have representation in the UN. And that's because that seat was given to the Republic of China, which at that time was only in charge of Taiwan.
The United States lost the fight to keep nationalist China in the United Nations, and the Albanian resolution to admit communist China to the UN was passed, and Taiwan was sort of booted out. It was a moment of what's been described as, quote, a shocking demonstration of undisguised glee.
The United Nations today crossed a very dangerous bridge, and that's the question of expulsion. In calm reflection, I think we're going to recognize that there's been a very serious mistake.
The United Nations will convene without a delegation from Taiwan. Officials in Taiwan have expressed regret and discontent over being rejected by the International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol. The island was excluded from an assembly of the International Civil Aviation Organization in September.
Taiwan has been excluded from the Global Health Conference for 3 years in a row.
Taiwan's exclusion comes down to only one factor: China.
Cases are climbing, and even more restrictive lockdowns are looming as the virus imposes a renewed threat on the island. Taiwan saw 0 reported infections for 253 straight days last year between April and December. In total, there's only been 14 confirmed COVID-19 deaths.
The WHO considered Taiwan's membership
Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah, let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
Oh. Wow.
Are you, in principle at least, in favor of the idea of formal Taiwanese independence?
The idea is this: we don't have a need to declare ourselves an independent state, but we are an independent country.
解决台湾问题，实现祖国完全统一，是中国共产党矢志不渝的历史任务。要坚持。
大家好，大家新年平安。没有台湾人无法度过的难关，面对挑战，台湾人不仅不会怯弱，还会团结起来，变得更坚强。谢谢大家。作为台湾人，要能够承担失败，在失败中再站起来。 台湾的政治的存在，每一天都在受到威胁。对于台湾来讲，它其实是一个长期的战争。有一些国家也面临同样的情况，它面临的外部的压力的时候，人民反而会更坚强。那 我也相信，以台湾人可以面对困难，而且不放弃，时时的保持自己一个旺盛的一个意志，这个是我对台湾人的期许。那我也相信台湾人是有这个能量。那么同时，我也常常告诉我们的年轻人，作为一个台湾人，没有选择坐在家里不走出去的权利，我们只有一个选项，就是每一个台湾人都要走出去。 到世界的每一个角落，让世界看得到台湾。
Okay, the Brits definitely took the teeth out of my movie, and that was the softest, most diplomatic version of things. Like they cut off Xi Jinping after he says in that last speech about insisting on unification. It's not reunification because, as the facts of history show, the Republic of China has never been a part of the People's Republic of China. So kind of countering China's narrative is very important. It's a function in the film. He says that the people of China will not be bullied and they will bash, bloody the heads of anyone who dares to stand up to their mission to unify Taiwan. President Tsai's formulation of we're already a de facto country, so we don't need a formal declaration of independence is really important and has been carried on by the current president, Lai Ching-te. I think the reference Bill Stanton. I don't know if any of you know him. He's at AIT. He has been at AIT in Taiwan, and he's served in the State Department in Beijing and knows Kissinger very well. And he was basically referring to the fact that our diplomatic position toward Taiwan and China never changed, and that was largely because of Kissinger. And there is a bigger critique to have there if that's of interest to people. It also, we removed in these 4 clips a whole sequence on, I was with the military of Taiwan when they were demonstrating their capability in Penghu. And, you know, I mean, their military budget, China's is 20 times that of Taiwan's. But the people of Taiwan do plan to fight, and that is also a sequence in the film. You see them civil defense training, learning how to be ready for an invasion, which they've been aware could happen for decades. You know, once I had lived in Taiwan, 95, 96, I went to work at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I learned Taiwan is a flashpoint for World War III, and the thinking at the time was don't talk about Taiwan, engage China economically, and it will become a peaceful neighbor, and it will politically liberalize. And not only did that not happen, but we were ignoring what was happening in Taiwan when it did become a democracy, and probably the ideal time to diplomatically recognize it would have been around 96 when Lee Teng-hui came to the United States, that's also in the film, and made a plea for recognition and independence. And there were plenty of Congress people who wanted to, and Kissinger said, absolutely not. So, you know, in a way, obviously, it's clear that peace and stability has been maintained in the Taiwan Strait up until this point. But now that you have such an imbalance of power, and China's military is so capable of a short, sharp invasion by 2027, we really need to be looking at what can be done for Taiwan now, and it's not okay that they're sitting ducks. Questions?
Wait a second.
Oh.
Can we get Evelyn back? So while we're waiting for this, I always like to give you kind of a summary when I listen to folks in a room, and I'm the moderator. And so we have 2 very different viewpoints here. One is Ms. Hope's looking at the grand scheme. There's actually a female leader in there, which I think is pretty incredible. And you did get just a little bit of up close dynamic with a global leader that you probably wouldn't find anywhere else in the major media. So I think that's really exceptional. So you've got that Taiwanese kind of picture of large political realm. And then we had Evelyn with the former fighters and these hot spots around the world. So I think you've got a fantastic spectrum here, not only of filmmaking, but of women in these realms. So, okay. Yeah.
Can I fill in?
Absolutely.
Fill in 2 more things that you just reminded me of. The one other sequence in the film that wasn't in the clips is about the first island chain and Taiwan's importance to it. Matt Pottinger, who you may know, was Deputy National Security Advisor under Trump, and he and I studied Chinese in Beijing in 1994. That's not how he ended up in the film. That was another story. But he speaks really clearly about it, and he has a new book called The Boiling Moat about how the Taiwan Strait can potentially help the people of Taiwan defend themselves. Also, you can speak to the Myanmar-Malacca Strait story, which is also important to China's sense of its capability. And then on female leadership, I would say that President Tsai, and first of all, President Tsai is the most popularly elected president of all time in Taiwan's history, and twice. And she also strengthened their democracy, was brave and bold in her policymaking. They passed same-sex marriage. She did transitional justice with their authoritarian past under the KMT, which did transition peacefully, to its credit, into another party in the democracy, which is a big deal. So it's a story also of how to transition from military dictatorship to democracy, which is really important. It's an important story to get out there.
Right, so those of you that are in national security studies, national security affairs right now, there'll be a quiz on the dynamic that you've actually learned here. There's some great international security pieces as well as the political realm. So really appreciate your input. I want to thank both of you very much for coming. It was exceptional, and I'm really pleased to meet both of you finally in person and online. And I'd like to give a shout out, Evelyn. I watched most of the things that are up online. It's exceptional. You can get a lot of them on YouTube, and I encourage you to watch the interviews that were actually had. It's a phenomenal story. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, nice to meet you, Evelyn. Thank you.
Please warmly applaud our panelists for the most interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the discussion this morning. Panelists, thank you so much for your time this week and all the preparation and travel you've gone through to be a part of the 11th annual WPS Symposium. Thank you, everyone. We will reconvene at 11:15 a.m. in Spruance Auditorium. Have a good rest of your day.
Bring me your WPS stories if you want to make movies about your stories.